Welcome back to the Matt and Eric Talk Twins podcast. We have a lot of movement in free agency finally, and the Twins managed to find a way to be a part of it. So everybody should be happy all around. But to start off, as always, I'm Eric. I'm here with my co-host Matt. How are we feeling this week?
Feeling good. Excited to talk about Victor Caratini and all the fallout from that deal.
We can certainly jump right into that with it being the most important Twins news that we got this last week. So for those that might have missed it, Victor Caratini signed for 2 years, $14 million with the Twins. Notable, as we'll get into in a second, because it's almost the same size as Ryan Jeffers' expiring contract. And also notable because we kind of have a logjam here now, so something's going to have to give. But before we get there, are you excited about this signing, Matt?
Yeah, I'm excited. I think Victor Caratini is a pretty similar player to Ryan Jeffers. Above average hitter, especially for a catcher, with questionable but passable defense. I think it's interesting that the Twins now, after initially signing Jason Castro and then having Mitch Garver as well, and Christian Vasquez, all of whom were above average defensive catchers. It's interesting now to see them have a pair of passable but questionable catchers. And I like this deal just because it's essentially, if you view Caratini and Jeffers in the same way, it's essentially them adding another Ryan Jeffers for just one extra year at the same salary, which I think the Twins would love to have given Jeffers a 1 year, $7 million extension. So I think it makes sense. It just is a real interesting roster fit now for how they're going to play Jeffers, Caratini, and Alex Jackson simultaneously. And I think the answer might be that one of them just isn't around next year, or we see some big trades elsewhere on the roster.
Yeah, I mean, Caratini does have a decent amount of experience playing first base. He's been doing that more and more recently, ever since he came to Houston, at least. So you can see a fit in a world where all three of Jeffers, Alex Jackson, and Caratini could stay on the roster and get to the number of games and at bats that the Twins would probably want to see out of them. But I've already been pounding the table for Ryan Jeffers trade just based on the fact that we're almost certainly not going to extend him if we haven't already at this point. And I would think that this addition probably is the writing on the wall for Ryan Jeffers, which a little disappointing to see as Twins fans because obviously he came up in the system. He's been a Twin for life so far, but certainly not one of the hardest goodbyes that we've had in the last year. And I think that there could be a bit of an exciting market for him if the Twins end up deciding to trade him.
Yeah, 100%. And like I said, I don't see Jeffers and Caratini as all that different. And Caratini, we have another year of control now for about the same cost. And you'd also be adding whatever we can get back for Ryan Jeffers, which, I mean, I think it's a really hard market to predict. There's not a lot of catchers who change hands. And so we'll see what it ends up being that we get back for Jeffers if we trade him. But assuming we get something of value, I think it's a really shrewd move. And I think it's probably not something that the Twins came into the offseason expecting to be able to do. It's probably just a situation where Caratini got a lot cheaper than they thought he was going to. He fell into their laps, and they decided to pull the trigger on it. But I think, honestly, as you pointed out, Caratini has a lot of experience at first base. He's made at least one start there every year of his career. Last year in Houston, he started 15 games at first base. He's at least capable of playing there part-time. And I wonder if they don't end up moving Ryan Jeffers, if we see Caratini play a decent amount of first base as well. He would be kind of a natural partner over there with a guy like Cody Clemens. You could play Caratini against lefties. And against lefties, you're going to want both Caratini and Jeffers in the lineup anyways. So I think that could make some sense. You could then option Wagaman to the minors and have Caratini be the backup first base or the backup catcher / part-time first baseman. I think it just gets really interesting in that situation then for how you deploy Alex Jackson, who's out of options. It's possible because he has a guaranteed, I think, $1.2 million contract it's possible that the Twins feel that they can pass Jackson through waivers, and he'll go unclaimed and they can stash him at AAA. But at that point, you now have over $1 million sitting in AAA, not a part of your everyday plans for a team that has a pretty low payroll. It seems like a poor use of resources.
Not to mention that he was already on waivers in Miami when we traded for him, or he was headed to waivers at any rate. So the idea that we would give up an asset, even if it's not that important of an asset, give up anything to trade for him, to jump the waiver priority and make sure we get him, just to also send him back to waivers before the season even started, would be a really frustrating use of our resources. But I am of the belief that this signing definitely spells the end for somebody. There's a few other guys we'll get to in a minute that I think could be trade or cut candidates if they do want to keep Ryan Jeffers. But the reason I think this is such a shrewd move for the Twins that I actually really like is now that Caratini is off the board and also JT Realmuto, who went back to Philly just earlier in the day before Caratini got signed. Now that both those guys are off of the free agency, the, I would argue, best catcher available is Christian Vasquez. He, at any rate, is the only free agent catcher still unsigned that posted at least one WAR last year. It's bleak to say the least. So, any other teams that might still be looking for a catcher, any teams that missed out in the JT Realmuto sweepstakes, I think obviously for a while it was looking like the Phillies were going to go get Bo Bichette or a higher leverage bat and let Realmuto walk. That didn't happen. So I think that there could be a surprising amount of teams that were interested in Real Muto that got a little bit burned by him that are now going to have to pivot and do something. And I don't think that something is going to be on the free agent market, because if you were looking to add JT Realmuto, I don't think you want to settle for a Christian Vasquez or Elias Diaz or Austin Barnes or Gary Sanchez level catcher to replace him.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we already heard yesterday that the Tampa Bay Rays are exploring the market for a catcher. They were in on JT Realmuto, and currently their catcher position is filled by just Hunter Fiducia and Nick Fortes. So I could definitely see them making a move. And interestingly, the Rays are kind of known for always having a very good bullpen. And that's been consistent over the last few years. Obviously, now they have Griffin Jacks there. They have a lot of other set up middle relief caliber guys who would be really interesting in the Twins bullpen, and could be controlled for a couple years. Looking at it right now, Brian Baker could be an interesting arm for them, although they did just trade for him from Baltimore at the deadline. So who knows if they'd really be willing to give up Baker. Other guys like Garrett Clevenger could be interesting. He has 2 more years of control. He's a lefty. He has a track record of success. He could potentially be a guy that they try to move on from. I don't know. They always have a bunch of arms, and they're always willing to trade them. So I wonder if the Twins could be looking for a Jeffers for a Lever type swap. It seems like that would solve a lot of issues. Otherwise, they also generally have a pretty deep farm system. So it'd be pretty easy to put together a package for Jeffers. And I think that's probably the most likely move. But I don't know. I think there's going to be a surprisingly large market for Jeffers if the Twins end up moving him. And honestly, I'm not convinced that he's going to be moved, but they have a lot of options nonetheless.
Yeah, I think the big thing for Jeffers is that he just hits well enough that even if he's your backup or platoon catcher at best, you can still get him days at DH and feel good about that and get more value out of him. Because I do think that this late in the offseason, you're going to be hard pressed to find teams that have no options at catcher, but we're also becoming an increasingly split catcher league where it's pretty rare for any catcher nowadays to start more than 100, 120 games max behind the dish. So I think that it'll be interesting to see where his market sits because, like you mentioned, we don't really see catchers of Ryan Jeffers' value even hit the trade market a ton, which could be cool. Is also quite terrifying because, especially after this last trade deadline, I don't know how much I trust Falvey and the front office anymore and their player valuation. think that's something that will get a lot better read on in 2026, as a lot of these pieces that they traded for had an off season to develop with the Twins, time to acclimate to the team, to the area, to the coaching, make some adjustments. But right now, the jury's still out on them in their trade market. So I think it'll be a little bit scary as long as Ryan Jeffers is on the market. The other, I think, most logical option, we're going to go back there. We're going to bring it up again. If you really do want to have Victor Caratini play more of a platoon first base role, that probably pushes Josh Bell to be more of an everyday DH. And if Josh Bell is DHing every day, where does Trevor Larnach go? He already hardly fits on this roster. If he's not going to get DH bats, he's not really providing any value at that point to the Twins. So I do think that something's got to give. And if it's not Ryan Jeffers, I think once again, Trevor Larnach looks like the easiest guy to move on from.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, the Twins just have so many left-handed hitting outfielders. We've said it a million times. They have a lot of better options out in the field, and they also have better options at DH. I would love to see Matt Wallner get more DH time. Would love to see Josh Bell get more DH time. And the Twins' defense has been really bad the last few years, and honestly isn't getting much better. They replaced Christian Vasquez now with Victor Caratini, and they replaced the Gold Glove winner, surprisingly, last year in Ty France for Josh Bell. So for a team whose defense has already been pretty questionable, it's looking it looks really rough for next year as it currently stands. So I think being able to move some pieces around and potentially get better defensively while adding a pretty solid bat in Caratini makes a lot of sense. And Caratini's versatile; he can catch as well, which obviously boosts his value. And he also gives them a catcher option for next year when Jeffers is gone either way, which I think is very important as we look ahead to our future at the catcher position. I don't know that Alex Jackson is necessarily a starter for the next couple of years. They have him under control. I don't think the Twins view him that way. And it's still going to be 2 or 3 years at a minimum before we see Eduardo Tait. He's still 19 in single A. So I think it goes a long way towards strengthening the Twins' future at catcher as well as the short term. It's just going to be very interesting to see how they can make all the pieces fit. I feel like we've been saying that about their offense all season or all off season, and even the pitching staff. Honestly, they have kind of a lot of redundant players, left-handed hitting outfielders, and starting pitchers. So I think this spring training is going to be a lot more interesting than most, where we see how all these battles get decided, where players end up going, and see how guys are going to be used. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how they sort out their catcher, first base, DH setup.
I think probably the scariest answer to me is that they just might not figure it out during the off season. We keep saying that something's got to give, but it doesn't have to give. I think there's a world where all of these guys somehow make the opening day roster and the Twins just kind of ride the hot hand. The reason I'm not a big fan of that is because I think every guy that might be considered in a trade, every guy that might be movable, is going to have more value right now in the offseason than they will at any point in the regular season, especially if they become movable during the regular season because they've shown they don't have the hot hand and they've fallen out of favor with the Twins. So, as I've said many times before, I don't think the Twins are a team that can afford to just let guys walk for zero value. So, I would really like to see them make it a priority to get somebody moved to make a more clear cut path going forward for at least 2025 in terms of what we're going to do positionally.
Yeah, I also think it's important to note that the Twins don't necessarily have the option of just riding the hot hand just because there's only so many bench spots and they have a lot of guys that are out of options. So, looking at their current projected bench, according to Roster Resource, it has Edouard Julien, Cody Clemens, Austin Martin, and James Outman. First of all, I don't think that this is a real bench option. Again, this is with Caratini being the DH and Trevor Larnach in left field, which is important to note. But I don't think that this is a real possible bench configuration because it gives you no coverage at shortstop whatsoever. So if Brooks Lee goes down, you have Austin Martin probably playing shortstop or Eddie Julian, which is not good. And of these four guys, three of them are out of options. So you can't send down Julian, Clemens, or Outman. And then this is also with the assumption that they are already DFAing Alex Jackson as he's not on the roster and out of options. And that's also with Wagaman getting demoted, although he has options, it's less of a big deal. It's with Vidal Brujan and Orlando Arcia getting DFA'd. It's with Ryan Kreidler getting DFA'd. They have a lot of options, and they can't really. I don't know. They can't carry them all on the roster, and a lot of them they don't have the flexibility to get sent down. I think you don't have to spend too much time shedding tears if Eddie Julian gets DFA'd or you lose Cody Clemens or whatever. But it's important to note that they don't necessarily have a whole lot of flexibility to see these battles out.
I mean, I think you hit it right on the head, though, where all these names we're talking about, Wegeman, who wouldn't even have to be DFA, but Arcia and Kreidler, nobody's losing sleep over DFAing these guys. They would be DFA'd because they just don't have enough of a market to even be traded in the first place. So I'm not as worried about that. To the point of Brooks Lee being the only capable shortstop on the roster, it's certainly not ideal. I don't think he's a guy you want to see playing 162 games at shortstop. But also, if he gets hurt, he goes on the IL, and that opens up a roster spot for them to bring in another shortstop. It's not ideal, but they could live with it. I just I think that they might be holding on to these guys into spring training just to see again who they like the best, but also injuries happen every spring. Teams are gonna need emergencies, even if it's just to be a spot fill, a backup type of guy. That's pretty much all the Twins have to deal right now anyway. So I could see a world where we come into spring training with actually a lot of position battles to watch, and most of them just end up getting resolved by either DFAs or low wattage trades. But I do think that the Twins are looking at this situation and thinking we could do this for a year. We could be this team for 1 year.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I will say there's a couple of guys who I think have more upside or more intrigue than your standard DFA. Um, Largely, I'm thinking about like Edouard Julien. Yes, he's had a couple of rough years, but his rookie year was fantastic, and he still is showing a lot of the underlying skills that we would look for. He has a really extreme skill set. He's not much of a defender. He strikes out a lot. But I mean, as we talked about a couple episodes ago with Julian, I think there's still reasons for optimism, and I think that there are teams out there who'd be willing to give up something for him. It's probably not anything of note, but maybe you can get a middle reliever for him. Maybe you can get something real cheap. I think that would be a good use of Eddie Julian for the Twins, and it clears up one more bench spot. Because honestly, even if Eddie Julian is on the bench, I don't see how he factors into their plans at all. Because he hasn't hit enough to be a DH solution. He's a bad defensive second baseman, and second base is where you're arguably most set with Luke Keeschel. And he's also not a great first baseman, hasn't gotten a lot of time there. And you have other options like Bell, who's not a good defender, but has a lot of experience, or Caratini. So I think there's just not a clear fit for Eddie Julian on the roster, and I'd like to see them trade him for at least some value.
I mean, my counter argument though would be, as you just pointed out, Josh Bell's not a good first baseman defensively. Caratini looks like he can pick it there. It's a pretty common pipeline to go from catcher to first base, but he doesn't have a ton of experience there.
He has
And
more
while
experience
we
than Eddie Julian, though.
that is fair, doesn't take a whole lot to reach that, but Luke Keeschel, also not exactly a sterling defender at second base. Also a guy that you're probably going to see at least some DH days out of. So I think that Eddie Julian has provided at least enough utility defensively, even if it's bad everywhere. It's already bad around the diamond. So if they wanted, I think there's a really easy world to keep him around for one more year. Because I think, as great as that rookie season was, if he comes back out, get him to maybe 100, at bats this year. And if he still looks like the same guy he has been the last 2 years, at that point, I'm ready to move on. At that point, I think you can chalk it up as, I don't know if you'd call it a fluke season, if the league just didn't have a good read on Eddie Julian as a rookie. I don't, a lot of different ways you could chalk up his rookie season, but we're so far removed from that at this point that I think he's kind of on his last legs with the Twins, but maybe just in the league as a whole as well.
Yeah, I definitely could see that. I will say Cody Clemens also has a decent amount of first base experience, mostly coming last season, but he looked pretty decent there. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways you could see this roster going. And like we talked about earlier, I think this is unlikely to be fully resolved until the end of spring training. I think we're going to have a lot of position battles to look at. I think the bench is going to be largely unsettled until a week or two before the season starts, which is perfectly fine. A lot of organizations have that happen. But I think just looking at the lineup, there's not clear fits for a lot of these guys. And I don't know. I think I have a hard time seeing the current catcher, first base, DH situation staying the same into the season. I think we just have one too many guys and someone has to go. I think the clearest route would be to trade Ryan Jeffers, although Jeffers is probably the most valuable of these guys. He would most impact the Twins' ability to succeed this year. So I'm not sure if you're trying to contend, if it makes sense to move Ryan Jeffers, unless you're getting a real competitive piece back, probably in the bullpen. Otherwise, I think Trevor Larnach makes a ton of sense to move, as we talked about. But I just don't think you can go into the season with three catchers projected to be on the roster, with none of them having a path to DH time. And honestly, I don't think there's a path to having three catchers on the roster just in general. And so I have a hard time seeing the Twins now moving on from Alex Jackson after trading for him and guaranteeing him a contract. And obviously, they can't move on from Victor Caratini after just signing him this week. So it really does feel like Ryan Jeffers is on his way out. But I guess that remains to be seen.
One guy I actually want to talk more about because we haven't really mentioned him much this offseason, and he factors in pretty significantly to this puzzle. Could Cody Clemens also not be a pretty good trade candidate? He put up over 1 WAR last year. He can play passable first base and both corners of the outfield. He hit 19 home runs. He was extremely streaky last year as a hitter for sure, but he's still on his arbitration years. He's incredibly cheap. I think that if the Twins did move Caratini to first base, we haven't really talked much about what happens to Cody Clemens at that point, because even if Caratini is your primary first baseman, which I think is the only tenable way to fit all three of these guys on the roster, you're going to have Josh Bell playing a primary DH. You don't really need Cody Clemens in the outfield. We're already overstocked there, and that's without getting rid of Trevor Larnach. I don't really know where Cody Clemens fits into this roster if we do end up keeping everybody else, and I think that he could be a sneaky, attractive trade piece across the league.
Yeah, I agree that Cody Clemens doesn't have too much of a fit on this roster. I think he has a leg up over a guy like Eddie Julian just because he has the ability to play more positions. He can play the outfield serviceably. He can play third base, play first, he can play second. He's kind of a pseudo utility guy. He doesn't have the ability to play center field or shortstop, which you'd like to see in a utility player. But I think he has some versatility. I will say I'm not a huge fan of the bat. You said last year he had 19 home runs, but he also was only a 95 WRC plus guy while primarily playing first base and second base, two positions that have a bar for offense higher than average. And so I think he's a fine bench option and a guy that the Twins could keep around for next year. By all accounts, they love him. But I don't think there's going to be much of a trade market for him just because last year was by far his best season, but also wasn't super standout. He put up 1.4 WAR, but it was also over 119 games. So he was playing almost full time and not really hitting offensively and just kind of a fine defender all over. Again, that's a solid bench piece, but not a guy that I think teams would go out of their way to acquire. And also, there's real concern for whether he'll be able to keep it up next year.
I mean, when we were talking earlier this offseason, we were looking at the Fangraphs projected WAR totals for the Twins. We talked about the lack of two WAR players that were projected on their roster. If you give Cody Clemens a whole 162 games last year, he's probably a two WAR player. It's not enticing, it's not sexy, but like you mentioned, it's better than Eddie Julian. It's better than I think a lot of these names we've been throwing out. I think you've got more value in Cody Clemens than you do in Alex Jackson. I think it's something that we just haven't really broached much this offseason because I do think the Twins like him enough that he's probably lower on their list of guys they'd be willing or trying to part with to fix this logjam up. But he has kind of gone under the radar in the sense that, like you mentioned, he's good, not great, and kind of fits everywhere, but also kind of fits nowhere. So I would not be all that opposed to seeing the Twins move on from him, even if it wasn't through a trade. If they just DFA him, send him back to the minors, I don't think he probably goes unclaimed, which is a sign that I think there is some trade value for him. But he's also not a guy that I think is really a part of our future plans very seriously.
Yeah, and I will say the counterpoint to extrapolating his last year numbers is that for 2022 through 2024, he played a combined 150 games and was worth a negative zero point 0.2 WAR. So we do have a full season sample size of him being a below even replacement level player. Yes, last year he was a lot better than that, but I think the true answer is probably somewhere in the middle, and that's where it's projected for him. So Fangraphs has 5 different projection systems available on their site currently, and the 5 of them project Cody Clemens for between zero point 0.1 and zero point 0.4 WAR. So he's slightly above replacement level, but definitely not a guy you have to go out of your way to hold on to or to trade for. I will say that zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.4 WAR is with 53 games played. So you could see him move into a little bit of a larger role, and then that maybe gets up closer to the 1 WAR figure where he was close to last year. But again, pretty much any player who has a firm hold on a major league roster spot over the course of a full season should be putting up close to 1 WAR. So I don't think he's all that great of a player or a guy that should factor into the Twins' plans. Speaking of other multi-positional utility guys, the Twins claimed Vidal Brujan off waivers from Miami. Or no, he was in Miami, went to Atlanta. They claimed him off waivers from Atlanta. Anyways, Vidal Brujan, former top 100 prospect when he was with Tampa. He was formerly a very fast prospect. He didn't strike out a whole lot. There's a lot of people who thought he could be a real multi-positional weapon who could steal a lot of bases and at least hit for a decent enough batting average to be a positive with the bat. That has not come to fruition, as Vidal Brujan, over his 5-year big league career, has been worth negative 2 WAR, including last year where he put up just 0.1 WAR in 61 games for 3 different teams. He just largely has not hit at all in the big leagues. He's a career 54 WRC plus guy. He's hit below 200, and also his speed has backed up a lot. He used to be a true, probably 70 grade speed guy. And over the last few years, his sprint speed has dropped off to the point where he's a below average runner. He can still play pretty much all positions. He's probably not a real viable shortstop or center fielder, but he's at least passable elsewhere. I guess to me, Brujan's not a guy that I think is all that intriguing. Yes, he's a former top prospect, but he hasn't done a whole lot in 262 games in the big leagues. And I think he's just not a really useful player because he doesn't hit, he doesn't field, and he doesn't run. I think the Twins maybe think there's a little bit more in the tank here, but I disagree. Eric, what are your thoughts on Vidal Brujan?
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the nose, and you said he doesn't hit, doesn't field, doesn't run. But right now, the competition for backup shortstop is Orlando Arcia. So the floor for Vidal Brujan to clear is so low, you would have to get out a shovel and start digging to find it. I think this again speaks volumes to where we're at right now as an organization. Obviously, they're talking about trying to be good, be competitive this year. You look at this Twins team and you want to believe that there's something more to it, but we're still talking about Vidal Brujan as a serious offseason acquisition that could play for the Twins. And that alone just gives me the icks. It gives me massive, massive icks because, as you mentioned, he's played 261 games over 5 seasons. He's already been at 3 organizations. None of them have ever liked him enough to give him even semi serious playing time. I was just on his Baseball Savant page. I don't think he's been a qualified batter in every year he played. And that's probably for the best for him because the numbers are just atrocious. The entire page is blue, which, if you don't know Baseball Savant, means he grades out in the bottom third percentile pretty much across the board. There's nothing he does well. Maybe the Twins think that they can come in and do some serious tinkering and unlock something with him. It can't really hurt to try because I believe, does he have options left? Do we know?
No, he's out of options. That's why he's bounced around so much the last few years.
Should also make sense. But even if he doesn't crack the opening day roster, which I think would be a shocker if he does, he's a guy that can at least be a good utility man in AAA while the Twins mess around with pretty much everything. I don't think there's any part of his profile that you would want to see stay as a player. But at the very least, as you mentioned, he's a former top 100 prospect. He's only 27 years old. It's a fun reclamation project for the coaching staff to work on, but that's all I really see out of him.
Yeah, I will say I think there's an interesting financial component here too because he is arbitration eligible and he signed a split contract with Atlanta where he if he's in the big leagues he makes 850,000. If he's in the minors he makes 500,000. And I believe since it's a settlement, both numbers are guaranteed. So the Twins, if they DFA him and they send him to AAA, he goes through waivers unclaimed. He gets stashed in the minors. They're still paying him $500,000 to sit in AAA, and it's not like they can just release him and get out of that money because it is guaranteed. And so I think for a Twins team that we've talked about all offseason not having a lot of money, having a guy who potentially is going to be making most of the league minimum in AAA and isn't really in your plan seems like a poor use of resources. In past years, the Twins have given $1 million to Jake Cave for the explicit purpose of sending him to the minors and knowing that he's going to go unclaimed and give them extra depth. But I think if we see them take that route with guys like Vidal Brujan and potentially Alex Jackson, it just is a little bit of a weird strategy to me for a team whose total payroll is only around 100 million. If 2 million of that is just guys in AAA that you don't necessarily have short-term plans for, but I guess that remains to be seen.
I mean, the flip side of that is I was already surprised by the Caratini signing because that was more money than I thought that we were going to end up dishing out this offseason. 14 million, by the way, in free agent contracts now still places us, I believe, bottom 3 in the league in money spent this offseason.
Yeah, something
But
like that.
yeah, either way, I don't know that we can spend much more to add. And I think that's, again, the terrifying part is I also don't think that it's a great use of 500,000 to ideally, if everything goes well for the team this year, just stash Brujan in AAA all season. But I don't know that they could have done much more. At least they now have a second player who can play shortstop. He's physically capable of it. He's done it in the past. It's not going to be good shortstop. But again, the competition's Orlando Arcia. Like, I think that to add Victor Caratini and Josh Bell, they said this is where we want to make our impact this offseason, knowing they weren't going to be able to add an impactful player at every position of need. So if this is what they have to do just to get warm bodies in the organization that could play shortstop in case of emergency, then I guess that's what you have to do just to have organizational depth.
Yeah, I don't know. The Twins' total payroll right now with the Caratini signing is just over 105 million, which is 23rd in baseball. It sounds like they have about 115 to spend this year, so they could add another $10 million. I would assume that's just going to be relievers. Although, as we've talked about, there's not a whole lot of money to, or not a whole lot of relievers that you're rushing to spend money on. Also, that number goes down if they end up trading a guy like Jeffers, who's making 6.7 million, or Trevor Larnach, who's making almost 4.5. So they have a little bit of space, but even still, Vidal Brujan is currently their 13th highest paid player, and Alex Jackson's 10th. So that's a lot of money to be spending on two guys who are probably in AAA if they hold their current roster. So I don't know that I agree with their strategy, but it's certainly interesting. Okay, I think moving on, just talking about all of the other players that have signed this last week. It's been a big week around the league. So obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably aware. But Kyle Tucker signed for 4 years, 240 million with the Dodgers, with opt-outs after the second and the third seasons. Similarly, Bo Bichette signed a 3-year, $126 million deal with an opt-out after every season with the Mets. And Ranger Suarez signed a 5-year, $130 million deal with the Red Sox. It's a straight deal, no deferrals, no opt-outs. And then JT Realmuto signed a 3-year, $45 million deal with the Phillies. Just going back to his home team and taking another trade possibility away from Ryan Jeffers. So a lot of movement. Eric, what are your thoughts on these deals?
Outside of the absolute outrage of the Dodgers coming off of back-to-back World Series wins, adding the best player in free agency this offseason, I saw a note on Twitter the other day, X now I guess, that after they pay out the luxury tax, which they'll obviously be in, the Dodgers will be for Kyle Tucker, they are paying, I believe it's 124 million per year to have Kyle Tucker on the roster, which is notable because that is a higher number than the Twins payroll, and I believe the number was a third of all teams in Major League Baseball. It's a rant that I don't know if I want to touch right now, but it's obscene that the Dodgers keep getting away with this. This one doesn't even include that much deferred money. It's only 30 million. So Kyle Tucker's largely getting this money up front, and it's not that it matters to the Dodgers because of who they are financially. I push back at the notion that Kyle Tucker's actually worth $60 million a year. When you look around, I mean, we're talking about Juan Soto and Shohei Ohtani AAV valuations. He's good. He's great. He's not that elite. He's maybe more of a top 15 to 20 hitter to me than he is a top five player. And I think that at most the top five players in baseball are the only guys that should be sniffing that 60 million AAV.
Okay, but that AAV, he got a higher AAV because he took a shorter term deal. Like both Soto and Otani are signed to decade long deals, whereas Cal Tucker's only here for 4 years. So there's a big difference in their contracts. I also think that Kyle Tucker is a star. He has put up some really consistent numbers over the course of his career. He's consistently a 4 to 5 win player. And honestly, I think he's been improving the last couple of years. He's dealt with some injuries, but he put up, I believe, 4 WAR in 2024 with the Astros and played less than 80 games. He's a star level player, and he's also young. He swings the bat real well. He can run. He can play defense. He's a 5 tool guy. And yes, he was expensive on an annual value basis, but he's also not a guy who's locked up super long term. This deal runs the same course as a lot of their star players. So he's just a bat that they're adding during their contention window. Yes, he's going to be expensive for them, but I think it makes a whole lot of sense for both sides. I'll also say, if you were wondering where you saw that statistic about how much Kyle Tucker is making and how much Dodgers are paying him, shameless plug, it was on my Twitter. And if the Twins gave Eugenio Suarez $20 million to be their starting first baseman, they still would pay the entirety of their roster less than the Dodgers are paying per year of Kyle Tucker. So yeah, it really puts into perspective how expensive this Dodgers roster is, how much money they have to spend, how much of an advantage they have over a team like the Twins. I'm very much a free market supporter as it comes to baseball, but the Dodgers are certainly pushing the limits as far as my views there.
Yeah, I think the big thing for me is I would just like to see some of the other offers that came in for Kyle Tucker because I understand he's an elite star player presence in this league. I understand it's on a shorter deal, which is why a 60 million AAV is more tenable, but there's a reason that the Dodgers were able to go out there and throw their money and get Kyle Tucker, and it's because I just don't think that the average team was willing and able to put that type of money into one singular player. And that's where I think we do have to start wondering what is the current state of the MLB's economics if we're hitting a point where the Dodgers have begun to realize that they can just buy every single player they want off of the free agent market every year. And there's just not really anything that anybody else can do about it because I don't know that there's more than three other teams in the league that could even afford to put this type of money into one player. And that's even looking at some of the top end teams. Like, I don't know that the Yankees, on top of already paying Aaron Judge and all their other stars, Garrett Cole and Max Fried, that they would have even been willing and able to go out and put another 60 million a year on the books for Kyle Tucker. If we're talking about contracts that even the Yankees can't afford to do, we are in the absolute most bizarre timeline.
Yeah, it looks like John Heyman reported that the runner-up for Kyle Tucker was the Blue Jays, who gave him an offer of 10 years, 350 million. So if you're looking at 4 years and 240 with opt-outs, or 10 years and 350, I feel like it's a slam dunk, no-brainer for Kyle Tucker to take the Dodgers offer. The same could be said about the Phillies with the Bo Bichette deal. They were offering him, I think, 7 and 200, and he got 3 and 126 with the Mets with opt outs. I think we're seeing players want to maximize their annual value and bet on themselves to continue to perform, at which point they can opt out or sign another deal after the deal ends. And I think that makes sense. Teams are more willing to pay higher AAVs when they're not taking on the risk of a long term deal. And so I think the market's behaving rationally. It kind of sucks for baseball fans because if you're a team like the Twins, you can maybe stomach a 25-30 million dollar AAV over a long term and just hope that this player succeeds. But it becomes harder to fit a 40, 50, $60 million player onto the roster in any given season. So I think, and also like just for fans around the league, I think fans generally want to see their star players be on the team for the length of their career for many, many years. And so I think from a fan interest perspective and just for small teams, small markets, it's probably not the greatest move for the star players to start taking these shorter deals. But from an economic perspective, it definitely makes sense.
So I was thinking about this a lot because I don't think that a salary cap and floor are the answer to the problems that the MLB is facing right now. But I think that the MLB could glean a lot from what the NBA has done recently in terms of restricting contracts. So I think the biggest hurdle to this is that the NBA does have maximums on the deals that players can sign still. There's max contracts in terms of years and value. And the way the NBA has been able to promote this homegrown talent staying in their hometown team is by allowing teams to spend more money, offer more on a max deal to retain their guys, and they could go out and get in free agency. So I'm curious off the cuff if you know how we can maybe work this into the MLB, but I think that is one of the better mechanisms I've seen implemented in any league for a while. And I think some sort of reward for a player to re up with the team that he has been with is something that the MLB could really use right now.
Yeah, the thing is that deal, like the way the Players Association operates, they would just never accept that kind of deal without some real trade offs because they're very staunchly against limiting the cap on what players can sign for. They want absolutely nothing that can limit a player's earning potential. And so putting a cap on it would be pretty much a non starter from the player's side. And also, I think it also wouldn't do a whole lot to change where these players are going because teams like the Pirates, yes, they can outspend the other teams, but if they don't have a floor in place to say you have to spend this money either way, you might as well sign your star player. They're just still going to have $100 million payroll and let that player walk to another team. That other team's just going to be paying that guy less. So I think having a limit on having a limit on contracts is going to be a non-starter for the Players Association, but also probably won't resolve the issue. I don't know that I have a perfect solution. I think probably something like a cap and floor is going to be the best option. So we've seen every other league do. And it becomes more doable with our revenue sharing model changing a little bit. It looks like Major League Baseball is taking control of more teams' broadcasts. It allows a more national, fair, even revenue model for all teams. I think that's the big competitive advantage that the Dodgers have. Is they're making, I think, like $340 million from the TV deal, while the Twins are making at best $50 million selling their own rights. And so if we get to a system where every team is making the same amount of money from their contracts, which could be possible now that regional sports networks are failing. Major League Baseball is taking over more of their broadcasts. If we get to a system where every team is broadcast by Major League Baseball, or Major League Baseball is selling the rights to their broadcasts, we have a universal amount of revenue that every team is sharing from that. It makes it easier to then implement a cap and floor system where the small market teams don't have the ability to cry poor and say, well, we're not making as much as the other teams because they now are. It forces them to spend a certain amount. It caps the amount that a large market team can spend. It overall raises the floor, a little bit lowers the ceiling, but somehow gets us closer to about a 50-50 split of revenue between the players and ownership, and it makes every team competitive. I think that is the dream scenario. The problem is that the big market teams, the Red Sox, the Dodgers, the Yankees, the Mets, the classic big market teams, have no incentive to agree to this sort of structure. The only reason that they would join is if they were kind of forced to by Major League Baseball or if their own regional sports network collapsed, much like the smaller teams have. And I don't think that that's coming anytime soon. So honestly, I think that the solution here isn't going to be solved in the next CBA or maybe not even the one after that. It's more of a long term problem. But I think it's going to start with making revenues more consistent team to team. And then you can implement a cap and floor kind of system and work with the Players Association to get the total spent on revenue, the total percentage of revenue spent on players to an acceptable level. And then you can adjust the cap and floor from there. You can show the players, this is how much you're making of our total revenue now. Here's what you'll make in the new system. Every team can spend competitively and no team can blow others out of the water. I think that's my perfect solution, but again, it's a long-term rollout kind of thing and not something that could be solved in the short term.
I actually really like all those plans. The only issue is that there's so many different forces acting in different directions, and I think that's what has plagued the players union especially for so long, is that the owners are generally unified in we want more money in our pockets, less money in the players' pockets, spend less money. Pretty simple. All 30 owners have the same goal and objective. The issue with the players' union is that there's so many players ranging from your stars at the very top of the league to the guys who have been career AAA guys, quad A guys who are just fighting to make a roster every year, where it's so much harder to find any sort of solution that is going to make everybody happy just on the player side, and then let alone, like you mentioned, trying to get all 30 owners on page on some of these revenue sharing agreements. I think that's where you really start to get kind of at the heart of the owner's cash cow. And I think that's where things get really contentious really fast. And I just don't know if I have a good answer for that. I think that's the most frustrating part about the MLB and how it's been laid out, is that it's such a massive sprawling league compared to every other professional sports league in the United States, that these labor negotiations always get so contentious because it's not just two sides going at each other. It's two sides going at each other with at least two sides within each of those sides going at each other, where there's so much infighting that it makes all of this such an angry, ugly, messy situation. And it is. It's so dispiriting to hear us talk about, well, I don't think that this is a issue that we're going to resolve in this CBA or the next one, which I think you're spot on about. It is mind-boggling to me that we can sit here as young 20-year-olds talking about the economic issues facing the sports and think about how we could be having kids before they start resolving this issue. Like, this is something that our kids could be talking about in 20 years, because I don't know when or how the MLB ever fixes these issues. And I feel like in the end, it's just going to take some sort of really big reckoning that radically changes and alters the league. I don't know if we're ready for that as fans, let alone as owners and players would be ready for it. So maybe there's no happy ending to this rant. Maybe this is just me getting a little bit existential about how baseball exists right now and the future that it is projecting.
Yeah, I do think that the big outside force that could shake this all up is the fall off of the RSN model. Not having those regional sports networks be viable or paying out as much to all these teams definitely gives Major League Baseball a little bit more bargaining power within its own group. I think Major League Baseball is going to control, I want to say, 19 of the 30 broadcasts this next year. So it's largely just the large market teams that are holding out and not a part of the MLB umbrella. And so I think it's possible that they are able to kind of reconcile those two sides, especially as some of the bigger RSNs, I'm thinking Yes Network or whatever the Dodgers one is, or
SNY, I believe,
I,
for the Mets.
what's that?
SNY, I believe, for the Mets.
Yeah. And I think it's Nesson for the Red Sox.
That
Anyways,
sounds right.
whenever all these regional sports networks start to collapse, they become non-viable themselves. It might force those teams to kind of join the MLB umbrella. They still won't like the idea of getting even revenue sharing from that umbrella, just because if you're the Red Sox or if you're the Dodgers, you know that you're contributing more than a 30th of this pie. So that's going to be a tough pill to swallow for them. But I think regional sports networks falling apart and Major League Baseball controlling more of the broadcasts is going to be the catalyst for this whole conversation. But it's definitely something that I think is going to get real heated, both between the owners and the players, also amongst the owners themselves. And also another thing I want to point out is that ownership generally has, well, universally, they just have a natural bargaining position that's a lot better than the players. If you're an owner, you're already much wealthier than any player in baseball. And B, you have a window for making money that expands for the rest of your life. You own this team. This team's going to be profitable. It's going to be appreciating in value for as long as you own it. Versus players, you might only have a 5 or 6, maybe if you're really good, a 10 to 15 year window where you're going to be making all of your money. And so when we get to a lockout sort of situation, the owners have all of the advantage. They could write this whole season off and nobody makes any money and baseball goes away for a year. And yes, it hurts them, hurts their bottom line. hurts fan interest, but they have the ability to do that versus the players. If you take a year's worth of salaries away from every player in Major League Baseball, every player in minor league baseball, that's financially crippling for the majority of those players, and they're losing out on large sums of money that they'll never regain in their lifetime. And so missing a whole season is a non-starter for most major league players, and it's probably pretty much fine for the owners. And so I think that's the clear point where the owners have more bargaining power and are able to kind of impose their will on the players. And I don't think it's right. It's not fair, but it's also not something that you can really counteract if you're the players.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that in 21 when we had labor negotiations. I think that was ultimately the breakthrough that got everybody to the table to shake on a deal again. It was the owners basically, yeah, threatening exactly that, no pay for everybody for a year. And that's why last time that we had these labor negotiations, I think what's going to be fascinating to me is when something larger breaks the players' way, because I think the owners will always be fine conceding these small wins to the players' union, like raising the minimum salary and all these other little tactics they brought into the last CBA negotiations. Eventually, something is going to have to change. Something at the top of the market will have to be different. And I think that is the most fascinating and also kind of terrifying future that we have to look at, because something big is coming at some point and it's going to change the game.
Yeah, I think also it's important to note like how this is the timeline for when this will be happening. So widely it's expected that following the 2026 season, heading into 2027, when the CBA negotiations happen, it's likely that we will see some sort of lockout occur during those labor disputes. And if that happens, bringing it back to like a Twins perspective, how valuable does that last year of control for guys like Joe Ryan and Pablo Lopez, how valuable does that become? Because now if you're looking at a situation where maybe instead of 162 games, it's a 100-game season, or it's a 50-game season, or the season doesn't happen at all, what happens with those players? Are they as valuable? Do teams want to trade for them still? It gets really interesting, especially when we talk about, these guys might get traded at the deadline or they might get traded next off season. I think their value's more in flux than they would be most years. It's hard to tell how much a team's going to be willing to pay up for these guys. And so I think that's another thing to note. There's just a lot of uncertainty in the market right now, and teams might be more opposed to taking big swings on guys. And we could be seeing that both in free agency and in trade, where teams know that a year from now, things are going to be really uncertain. We're not going to know what the system looks like. And so making long term commitments or big expenditures now is probably less appealing to teams.
I've kind of been getting the opposite vibe. Well, again, it's very much a split league right now, where I think the teams that can afford to pay are trying their hardest to get as many deals done now because they don't know what the new CBA is going to look like. I think that's the exact reason that the Dodgers went out and got Kyle Tucker. They're like, screw it. We're already the best team in the league. We know at this very moment what the financial landscape looks like, so we're going to get this done before we enter labor negotiations. But it does definitely frees up a lot of the future planning that most teams in the league can do. And I think that is only going to add, at least in the short term, but I would argue probably for years to come, that imbalance between the haves and the have nots in the league, where the teams that have it can afford to operate like usual, and this labor negotiation will be nothing more than a bump in the road for them. Whereas for a team like the Twins, they're pretty much coming to a complete stop, it feels like, and we probably won't know what they're doing again until after the labor negotiations are done next year.
Yeah, agreed. I think that makes sense. If you're a team like the Dodgers or the Blue Jays, you know that the current setup benefits you. It gives you all of the ability in the world to flex your financial might. So you might as well do so while you're still able to. So I agree. I think that's why the Dodgers are doing what the Dodgers are doing, and why we saw the Blue Jays real significantly up their own payroll this offseason. They saw that they have an opportunity, they have a good team, and they have a real chance to add on to it. And so I agree. I think small mid market teams are probably a little bit more cautious right now, and the big market teams are doing all they can to capitalize on the advantage they have. It's not a good place to be in if you're the Twins, and honestly, it makes me think, if the Dodgers are doing what the Dodgers are doing, and they're building super teams, and the Twins have no ability to really spend and compete at that level, would they be better off having fully rebuilt this offseason? I know nobody likes to watch a rebuild happen, but if you could get a big package for guys like Pablo Lopez or Joe Ryan, and push your contention window a little bit further down the road when the system might be set up more to their advantage, I think that could have made a lot of sense. It sounds like they're not going to go that way, but yeah, it's an interesting time in baseball. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of different ways teams can go, and we'll see how it works out.
My last thought here, looking at all of these more recent deals that we've done, there has been a lot bigger focus from both the player side and owner side on shorter, higher AAV deals, which obviously makes sense on the ownership side. We understand why it happens because these are guys like the Dodgers weren't going to sign Kyle Tucker to a 10-year deal like the Blue Jays were, but they're able to steal him out with the deal they gave him. But do we think that a lot of these star players accepting these high value, short term deals with opt outs could be a sign that they also feel confident going into these labor negotiations? I know we talked a lot when, especially the Bo Bichette deal broke, about the philosophies of taking the short term high AAV deal and putting yourself in a position where you're put back out on the market just a year or two later when you're already coming off such a great season. But maybe there is a lot of value to a lot of these guys in being able to test the market again, not just because they think they can have a better season, but because they think that a new CBA with new labor negotiations could maybe favor them in a year or two in a way that it doesn't right now. Is that logical? Does that track, or is that something that you think I'm just kind of spitting on?
Yeah, it could definitely make sense, especially when you if you take into account that currently player percentage of revenue has gone down for the last decade or so, if they think at some point after the labor negotiations we're going to be closer to 50-50, the total spent on free agents and players in general is going to be increased. And, maybe there ends up being a rush on guys in free agency. Teams now have more money to spend, or they're forced to spend more money, and that might drive up the cost of players. I think that's certainly something that I could see, but I just don't think the timeline for that happening is near enough. But players might disagree, their agents might disagree, and that could definitely be their line of thinking.
So, before we wrap up our episode today, we want to come at you with a bit of a new segment, something we've been cooking up recently. We're calling it the Monologue Minute. This is our time to really shine. It is going to be baseball related, but it could really be anything that's been on our minds recently, just something that we didn't really find the time or fit for in the podcast that we just want to get off our chest a little bit. So, I'm going to pass the ball and let you start with it here, Matt.
Yeah, so my monologue minute is about how weird the Twins' positional fits are. So currently, you look around the roster, and we have three catchers. We have one kind of first baseman, and guys who can kind of play there. We have a second baseman who is probably better suited as a utility man. He has questionable arm strength, and he did not field well last year. We have a shortstop who has long been thought to not be a major league caliber shortstop. He's probably a 40, 45 grade there. Probably would be better elsewhere, but he's the only shortstop we have. Our third baseman is, he's fine. Royce Lewis can play there defensively. But then you look in the outfield. Yes, we still have a star center fielder in Byron Buxton. We look at the corners, we have a hodgepodge of left-handed hitting outfielders who can't really do a whole lot else. That includes Alan Roden, James Outman, Matt Wallner, Trevor Larnach. We just have a lot of the same guy. Yes, I think a guy like James Outman is probably a fourth outfielder. He doesn't really fit the corner left-handed hitting bat role as much, but it doesn't make sense to have Larnach, Roden, and Matt Wallner all on the same roster, especially when your primary top prospects are Emmanuel Rodriguez and Walker Jenkins, who are, you guessed it, left-handed hitting corner outfielders. The infield also doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We have a bad defensive shortstop. We have a bad defensive second baseman. Who do we sign to play first? A bad defensive first baseman. And, oh, a catcher who can moonlight at first. And who are the primary backups at all these positions? Waiver wire first baseman, Cody Clemens. And then if he goes down, who's the other backup? I don't know, some minor league signings. We can figure it out. Or maybe Austin Martin can play the infield. He was bad in college, he's bad in the minors, and he's not a good defender in the big leagues, but we can put him in the infield. We can see what happens. It's just a very strange group of players offensively that don't really fit together in any cohesive way. And that's why I think that they need to make a trade or do something to clear up this logjam, but they don't see it that way. It's a defense that ranked pretty near the bottom in both outs above average and defensive runs saved, and they're going to be worse because they lost Carlos Correa, they lost the Gold Glove winning first baseman in Ty France, they lost Christian Vasquez behind the plate, replaced all of them with poor defenders. It's just going to be a bad defensive team and one that I'm not incredibly excited to watch. And that's without even talking about their pitching staff, which has just a million starting pitchers. They have about 3 decent relievers. And honestly, like, yes, you can say this guy's stuff will play up in the bullpen. Yes, we can move him to the bullpen. Oh, we can move that guy to the bullpen. Well, he's not really a starter. He can be in the bullpen. But at some point, someone has to pitch in the actual bullpen. And at the point where you're moving guys like Mick Abel or Taj Bradley to the bullpen, you wonder if you would have been better off just keeping the relievers that were already good and already elite and already under control instead of trying to hope that this guy can move into the bullpen and be as good as the guy that you traded to get this guy to move him into the bullpen. It's just a lot of moving parts. None of it really makes sense. In a vacuum, you can see how each thing works, but together doesn't make a lot of sense. It needs to play out in some way. I'm excited to see how it plays out, but I think there's other moves coming, or at least I hope for my own sanity, because nothing makes sense, dear God.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is why we've introduced the Monologue Minute. I think everybody can tell how badly Matt needed to get that off his chest, and for good reason. It's not like he's wrong about any of it. My Monologue Minute is going to take less of a Twins-oriented turn, not really Twins at all. But I was struck recently, especially after the Kyle Tucker signing, about a lot of the parallels I am starting to see between the MLB and their current CBA negotiations, labor standing, and the increasingly wild, wild west of the NCAA in their NIL and open transfer season that they're in right now. Notably, the reason this came to mind was Baylor this offseason added James Najee, who, if you guys aren't big college basketball fans, is 23 years old, has played overseas professionally for, I believe, 2 years. Notably, was already the 31st pick in the NBA draft 3 years ago, played in the Summer League against Victor Wembanyama, and somehow was given 4 years of eligibility by the NCAA to go play for Baylor because despite doing all of that, he never actually played in college basketball. And this, of course, created a massive, massive, massive amount of uproar from teams, fans, pretty much everybody involved in college basketball, as it should. And the NCAA's response is basically screw off. We don't care. If you want this fixed, if you want this regulated, go to the government. Get the House to weigh in, make them make us do something about it. And I think that is the most pathetic response I've seen by a governing organization in a long time. The reason this felt so close to the situation that we're seeing in the MLB right now is because I think a lot of these large market teams are acting in much of the similar manner, albeit in ways that are not shady or maybe questionable the way Baylor is dealing. But I think we're really starting to see an untenable situation where teams are realizing that they can just exploit their money for wins. I know that this has been a talk for forever with the MLB not having a cap or floor, but despite that, we've still seen a great amount of parity throughout the league as long as it's been alive for the MLB's entire history. that really starts to feel like it's coming to an end, especially with the Dodgers having won back-to-back World Series titles and being the presumptive heavy favorites after adding Kyle Tucker this offseason. And I think that the overall response from both players and league alike is equally pathetic and sad as the NCAA's response to their criticisms, where they've also basically just said, well, we have labor negotiations coming up. Maybe we'll talk about it, but we're probably just going to get really mad at each other and then not make any meaningful changes just in the name of being able to play baseball again. That's where I think I've been the most upset with the league recently. It's also why I've been bringing up the impending CBA negotiations and a likely labor stoppage, because it's the same argument that we made back in 2021. Sure, it sucks for the players. You're not getting paid. You're getting shafted by the owners. You have been for a while. You put yourself in this hole. The owners have been taking advantage of this for forever. They know that they're the larger financial entity. They know that every time labor negotiations come around, they can swing their big stick and the players can't do anything about it. And the only people that truly suffer at the end of all of this is the fans. It's ridiculous that as dedicated fans to not just the Minnesota Twins, but the MLB as a whole, that we're a whole year out from labor negotiations and we already have to talk with such urgent concern about where this league is headed, not just next year, but into the future. It's just such an untenable situation to be hanging over not just the league's head, but fans' heads for another half a decade. That was, I think, my biggest gripe with the last labor negotiation, that they basically just patched something together to get baseball played. And they said, well, we're going to revisit this in 5 years. Here we are 5 years later. Nothing has changed. Nobody's stances have softened. If anything, the game has just become more polarized between the haves and the have-nots. And until they can come together to make a serious amount of change in their labor negotiations, I think we're just going to be stuck in this 5 year cycle of, all right, we're about to have more labor negotiations. Everybody get ready for a lockout. Everybody brace to not play 162 games. And it's abysmal. To do that to your fans every 5 years on the clock, like a schedule, is ridiculous from everybody involved. And I'm tired of it. I want to see real change, and I want to see it sooner than later.
There you go, folks. That was our monologue minute. Basically, Eric and I just get to rant a bunch, so that's always fun. We'll be back again next week, hopefully with some more Twins news. Would love to see some trade signings between now and then. And as we're getting close to spring training, I would expect a lot of these moves to be coming in fast and furious after a few months of largely nothing. You can find us, as always, wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening to this, you already know that probably, but we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Eric and I are also on Twitter. I'm at CrepMatt, and Eric is at Holly_13. We've been making a real effort to post more on there, so if you want to get our initial thoughts on the Twins, any moves they're making, any research we're doing about the team, or just thoughts around the league, feel free to find us there.